Welcome to Press Review with Reaction. That's what we're calling it for the moment, which is our new show. Is that the right word? Where we're going to discuss the stories that really caught our eye and zero in on particular stories from the press, periodicals, stuff we've read from around the world. So not just limited to the UK press. And me, Tim Montgomerie from Reaction, and my esteemed colleague Maggie Pagano from Reaction. We're going to kick this around with guests and sort of see where it takes us. Press Review is the name. We just sort of, so adventurous, isn't it? We just dreamt that up ourselves a few minutes ago. If you have a better idea and you think it should be called something else entirely, but let us know. For the moment, it's Press Review. Tim, you're going to kick off with the first story which has grabbed you. I think it's from the Wall Street Journal.
No, it's not. That's a good start, Ian. It's from the National Review. I'm still smarting, though, from the way Maggie got introduced as esteemed colleague, and I just got a colleague. But
you were second.
I paid him a lot of money for that, Tim.
Yeah.
But you were second, and then I thought,
okay.
Maggie having gone third, then I added esteemed.
You don't need any introduction, Tim.
You're both esteemed.
So actually, mine is from the National Review, and before I sort of mention this article, I've become a massive fan. And one of the things I hope we will do on this press review, or whatever we call it, is not just look at articles and things, but podcasts and things that we've watched as well, and just recommend to you, our Reaction viewers, just things that we've enjoyed, and I hope that you will enjoy as well. And actually, the National Review Editors Podcast is probably my #1 podcast. And the National Review is probably, for those who don't know it, America's leading conservative, small c, magazine. Takes a very independent view of conservatism, quite a critic of Trump at times, and really just tries to build the conservative movement. And I listen to their podcast without fail, called The Editors. And it's just a brilliant overview of really what's happening in America from a conservative perspective, which I just don't think you can get from the BBC anymore, which I think the BBC's coverage of North America is absolutely hopeless, a subject that I'd like to cover more in rapid reaction videos. But the piece that caught my attention for the purposes of this press preview is a piece by Wesley Smith on China's ethical practices and scientific ethical practices. And obviously we've had the focus because of COVID on whether the whole nightmare of the last 18 months has really been inflicted upon us because of a leak from the Wuhan lab. I don't think we'll ever know now whether or not it was a leak. I'm sure if there was evidence there was a leak, China would have destroyed it by now. But this piece by Wesley Smith, who is an expert on sort of bioethics questions, just looks generally at what is happening inside Chinese laboratories, what's happening in China's scientific community. There's all sorts of, allegations of the kind of experiments that are being inflicted upon the Uyghurs that have been imprisoned in concentration camp. There's been August harvesting from Falun Gong people in the past. Of course, there's the forced abortion policy that China has been known for a long time. And what this article gets into is pretty gruesome reading, to be honest, but it's just the way that Chinese scientists, seemingly with the blessing of the government, are beginning to sort of mix animal and human DNA and stem cells in various ways. And they're looking at the possibility that animals will have increasing human consciousness, that we might sort of have a kind of animal-human sperm emerging soon. And just the lack of regulation, China's sort of willingness to just smash through all kinds of ethical barriers on science. And really it's a call for us to just, first of all, wake up to this as another issue to worry about China, but also, we're funding, one of the controversies that's hit Fauci, the American guy who we've become familiar with in COVID, is that actually British, American, European, United Nations, there's Western global money going into this Chinese scientific research. And we should ask much tougher searching questions about whether this is the sort of thing we want our cash being used for.
Yeah, I mean, it's a reminder, isn't it? It's another example. It's a really interesting piece. It's a reminder of just how little we know about what's really going on inside China. And this is the scientific dimension of it, but I was struck in the last week or so by the coverage or the lack of coverage of these floods in China. And you could see just by tracking various Western social media like Twitter, certain things managed to leak out in terms of video of the various tunnels that were flooded, and potentially hundreds. It's rumored thousands, but impossible to verify. And the sites then shut down afterwards. The site of the disaster, but it's reminding me very much of the way in which we used to perceive the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, that you had very little, until Chernobyl sort of blows that apart, you had very little idea of what was really going on behind. And in this case, it's a technological sort of iron wall, isn't it? And the regime can get up to all of this this sort of stuff. Maggie, what did you make of it?
Well, I haven't listened, but from what Tim is describing, it's horrific, and it raises huge issues, because what we've seen through COVID and the role of the WHO organization, that actually when it comes to a crisis like this, they're pretty ineffectual. Well, you might even say they were bought off. I mean, there are suggestions that the scientists they sent into Wuhan lab to do the investigation, in fact, their reports have been shown not to be true, haven't they, already? So I guess the question I would ask the National Review people is, how can it be regulated? Because it's clear that they either buy it off or they just carry on as they wish. They don't really care about regulation. I mean, if you want to really look what the Chinese have been doing, you look into Africa for the last 20 years. I mean, they own more land in Africa than twice the size of Germany. They've bought up all their minerals. I mean, it is, they do it by stealth. It's a very clever colonialization. It's an economic colonialization rather than an ideological one. And we haven't got a clue how to fight it. So I'd be fascinated to learn if they have any view of how we can try to control it. I mean, is it by economic sanctions? Do we stop trading with them to our own detriment? I don't know. How do we punish them?
Because the concern, Tim, about global institutions post the financial crisis, and Gordon Brown was very big on this immediately before the financial crisis and then after it, actually. His view was, and there was a widespread view among policymakers, was that the institutions of global governance and regulation on financial stuff were insufficient and outdated. And that's probably still the case, though arguably things have improved a bit since the financial crisis. But what this report highlights is that that's only 1/10 of it. There's this whole other ethical area where technology meets ethics, animal rights, human rights. I was just a bit like Maggie. I was left a bit baffled as what on earth can you do about it?
I think there's very limited stuff you can do about it. I mentioned the idea that we should stop at least funding, funding these institutions, these scientists, until we get transparency. But I just wonder how ever we will get transparency from a fundamentally authoritarian regime that frightens its own people into perhaps lying to us. There was the issue recently where I think it was an interview with Tom Newton-Dunn on Times Radio with the head of MI6, was it? That's the foreign intelligence one, isn't it? The MI6, saying that they were thinking of basically spying on China to see whether they were meeting their climate change targets, because you can't trust China to keep international agreements. We know that from what they're doing in Hong Kong. So I'm not sure we can do anything about this, but I think, as the hawkishness rises across the West towards China, I'm at the upper end of that hawkishness. I think we've got a totalitarian communist state that is trying to outbid us technologically, military, and economically. And I think we need to realize that they are a massive competitor to us. And this is just another issue where I'm afraid, you think of all the problems that could enter the generations. If you start messing with people's DNA and you start mixing it with animal, what kind of deformities might you see in children in the future? And I also worry, frankly, that one of the reactions of scientists in the West won't be horror, but some will say, well, we need to do this, but we need to do it a little bit more ethically. And actually, so rather than us trying to limit China, the impact of this experimentation under effectively a new kind of eugenics will be that it will lead Western scientists to further push the boundaries of acceptability as well. So the one thing we might need to do is just to be on guard ourselves at how our ethical frontiers could be shifted by what's happening in out of Beijing.
Yeah, I think so. Maggie, if you go next with your choice, so just one thing I wanted to say there about on the China situation is interesting counterpoint. I don't agree with this at all, but and quite provocative from Adam Tooze in the last week or so. Of course, he has a big new book coming out about the economic impact of the pandemic, and he makes the point, I'm paraphrasing, that we're actually quite lucky with China as an adversary or as a great power. I disagree with this. I think China is menacing, and the West needs to intelligently reorder and organize itself. But his view is, well, it's not starting major major wars, or it's not expansionist in the way in which the Soviet Union was wedded to an ideology which is seeking to export. But I'm hoping we'll get Adam Tooze on to talk about his new book, which I'm just about to start, and I can disagree with him about that. Maggie?
Well, can I just carry on that, because it's so interesting. One is, I think that's my point, is their colonialism, if you like, is far more invidious because it's economic and it's invisible and secret. And actually here in Britain, we had a good example of it this week, because the government finally woken up to the depth of the Chinese involvement in our nuclear industry, which our government has ignored for the last 20 years. So they now want the Chinese out of the next project at Sizewell and a third one. But if they do that, if they force them out, they might pull out of EDF. And then that means Britain will have, well, we might, to turn the lights out, all our nuclear power is switched off in 5 years' time. And we depend 20% on nuclear. So they're in a really, they've sort of caught us, really. I mean, whether they can pull out, whether they can do some sort of deal behind the scenes, but if they pull out of EDF, then I don't know who would fund it. The government would have to step in with billions. Yeah. Anyway, I just throw that into the pot.
Your next story.
Yeah, my story. Okay, well, I'm going to switch to France, where I think we can see the twitching for beginnings of next year's presidential election starting. And I don't know if people saw, it's on France 24, it's in most of the papers today, that Rachida Dati, the former justice minister in Sarkozy's premiership, has been charged with passive corruption for the advisory work that she did for the former Renault boss, Carlos Ghosn. And what the French financial crime authorities are trying to say is that that it wasn't just advising him, it was lobbying, because she was working as an MEP at the same time. And she made about €1 million during the time. But Rachida Dati, she challenged Anne Hidalgo for the mayor of Paris earlier this year, lost, but did very well. And she, of course, is going to go in for the primaries for the Republican Party next year. So you can sort of feel that the French authorities are trying to rubbish. I mean, she's hit back and said that it was completely innocent, but she had a role lobbying for Renault in North Africa. But the French are very clever, and it strikes me so interesting the difference between Britain and France, the way we treat politicians and finance. I mean, Sarkozy's been charged sort of for 12 years, but got off for 6 months. Probably she'll get off as well if they can find any crime. But whereas our tabloids sort of go for sex and rock and roll, don't they? In France, we can't do that. They go for finance, but never.
Let's not say that the president of France, former president of France, got off. Justice was done by the brilliance of the French legal system.
Yes, no, of course.
And he got, but you made a really good point, Maggie, about just the the difference. It always baffles me why anyone wants to be president of France, other than it's the most fantastic country, it's a wonderful country, and all of that. But no good ever comes of being president of France. It always ends in a disaster and humiliation, or a court case.
You get to marry Carla Bruni.
Yeah.
If you're Sarkozy, there are some good things. Am I allowed to say that?
I think you are. I don't think
you have to listen to Carla Bruni. You have to listen to Carla Bruni singing, and you have to say that you have to listen to all her albums.
Puts her on mute. But anyway, I just think we're going to see a lot of these stories over the next few months ahead of Macron's attempt to.
I really hope that we can start to see, and Tim mentioned the BBC in America. One of the hopes, presumably in vain, I had post Brexit, was that we would start to see France, and there are brilliant British journalists working in France. We have our own Walter Ellis, our correspondent, lives in France and writes a fantastic column every Saturday on life in Brittany. But that we would see more, and Walter writes a lot about French politics, that we'd see more of that and stop covering interesting countries like France and Germany and lots of other interesting countries in Europe through the prism of Brussels and how Brussels is engaging with us. It's a symptom of our long argument with the EU itself, and then the trauma of the negotiations. But can we go back to just covering France for its own sake? And that.
Can I just add something there, Iain? I always thought it was so paradoxical and slightly hysterical, the way, if you like, the institutions, BBC, ITV, Channel 4, were all so pro, let's stay in the EU and whatever. And yet, if you ever search for any decent European news on any of those channels, it was impossible to do. I mean, I would naturally always switch to Euronews or France 24. They weren't actually interested in covering them. They were only...
Maggie, you may have destroyed our chances of getting the brilliant James Mates to come on.
I'm sure.
As ITV's Europe correspondent and explain these things.
You get my point. We didn't really, just think of Dieselgate and all those great big scandals and stories that have been going on in Germany, the refugee. We see when there's a bomb blown up 5 minutes in the square, but actually going around and seeing, who's head of Rhineland, looking at the industry, looking at the car industry, there's no coverage at all. Germany's
the one that really baffles me, other than I presume any TV execs who are watching can tell us that it's the standard thing that if you ask viewers, they'll say they want lots of foreign news and that sort of thing, but really they're just not that interested in what's going on inside Germany. But it strikes me as weird.
Put it on late at night.
Here you have France and Germany, and I'm not excluding other countries, but even post Brexit, France is a huge military ally. We have great cultural connections with and common interests with Germany, but we just don't. Other than a handful of established print journalists and a few digital people, there's just really not that much interest. I don't know why.
The news is not the news, frankly, and the big bias is, of course, towards America, and we're all Eurosceptics to various extents, the three of us, but I would love more news about Europe. And actually, particularly through the Trump years, Trump news was all we got, and actually it's such a bias towards English speaking news. And maybe we can do a little bit in this press review to reflect a little bit on that, adjust to that.
Poland, another
yeah, or Hungary. Really, I mean, when have you seen any on the ground reports from what's happening? France, Italy, Spain.
We're going to get emails from BBC correspondents, aren't we, highlighting their work and their extensive reporting.
What we're doing is we want to hear more of them.
Yeah, exactly.
I wanted to have, I'm going to take control because it's Ian's turn to nominate something. I actually wanted sort of like graphics that they have on Sky, and Ian vetoed it, but I'm going to do it now anyway.
The flag. You can have the flag on the grid.
It's fit now.
Yeah. We're going to get some graphics sorted for the show as we develop press review, which is, well, if you've been watching this, you can see it's global in its
and chaotic
in its interest. And my story is the next one, which is, I'm maybe going to surprise people. I'm going to go for the FT on Monday, now slightly out of date, but I just thought it was a really good example of on the ground reporting. So the story is, headline in the print edition was Fed divided over right time to scale back bond buying, rising inflation and recovery prompt US central bank debate on stimulus. And this was hooked on the fact that, not widely reported in the UK or even in the US, that it was the crucial two-day meeting of the Fed's Open Markets Committee, which is this big deliberation on the state of US policy, US monetary policy. The big controversy, obviously, and it's troubling all central banks and policymakers at the moment, is when do you start tapering? Effectively, when does the bond buying stop, and what is the path to normalizing interest rates? And the question then, not resolved, and I'm not blaming any of the people involved. I've never known a period where policymakers, monetarists as well, Keynesians, people of all stripes are confused and are willing to admit that they don't know the correct answer on this, and that's partly because we're living in such strange times post pandemic. But they met, the upshot. The upshot, of course, is that rates stay at bottom 0 to 0.25%, but they have signposted that the bond buying, which I think is still running at about 120 billion a month, continues, but they're signposting that the shift towards a more normal environment is coming. And I don't have the answer to the argument to that question. Do you, Maggie, on inflation, whether this is just going to be it worries me intensely. It seems to me the biggest story in the world at the moment. And if this inflation is sustained and is higher than a lot of experts predict, then all manner of consequences flow from that in terms of the cost of government borrowing, consumer stress and strain. Already seeing wage price inflation in the UK. It's very marked. It's presented as a Brexit effect, but it's not just that. There's a lot happening in terms of global supply chains being stretched or disrupted post-pandemic. But I thought I wanted to highlight the FT piece just because it was a really good report on dividing into the hawks and the doves and the Fed, and explaining where they're coming from and what the dynamic, what the tension is in the Fed, which they kind of don't know quite what to do, but they've decided this week to sort of stick as is and point to a more normal future. Maggie, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, just briefly, I think they were sort of broadly right. It's how I would have voted should I've been asked to do so, because they're still betting the house that most of these rises are transitory. And I know you're much more skeptical than I am. And some of them are proving to be. So, for example, the price of lumber in America over the last year went up fourfold because everybody was at home, they're building new houses and extensions. Now, apparently the price has dropped back to what it was pre-pandemic already, as life gets back to normal. And then we had the Suez Canal thing. There were a lot of, and COVID disrupted supply chains. So I guess they're hoping that those disruptions and pipeline sort of blockages will ease, and we should get back to some sort of normality. And some of the wage increases that we're seeing in Britain actually are really very positive, aren't they? They are at the very low end, skilled workers. And again, there'll be adjustments. So, and then the big elephant in the room is if they start jacking up rates, you're going to have, certainly in Britain, a whole generation of people who've taken out very low, big mortgages at very low rates. And you don't want a repeat of sort of Black Tuesday, Wednesday again.
Thursday, Friday,
so I think erring on the side of caution is probably the right thing to do for now.
Tim.
Yeah, well, I like Maggie's confidence that we're returning to normality. I don't know what normality is in this world anymore, but I take your point.
Fair point.
And one place that just doesn't seem normal to me is America. I don't know exactly when they're going to pass the various bills, but they seem to have reached a bipartisan agreement on some infrastructure spending. But Joe Biden is still wanting to spend 3.5 trillion on various kinds of infrastructure, most of which is not really infrastructure. It's childcare. It's a whole sweep of domestic budget priorities. And that's twice as much money as the USA has spent in Afghanistan over the last 20 years. It's a huge amount of money. And Joe Biden, who some viewers will have noticed, has had some pretty ropey TV performances in the last week. You're really stumbling over, basic grammar, and just the sentences made no sense at all. The really good podcast actually by Freddie Gray at the Spectator USA, talking about his chief of staff, whose name briefly escapes me, but said is the real person running America.
The real president, yeah.
But Joe Biden has said we need to have this infrastructure spending because it will tackle inflation. Well, I can kind of understand the argument if you believe you've got infrastructure bottlenecks, that you could get rid of those bottlenecks. But actually, the basic definition of inflation is too much money chasing too few goods, and all this splurge of cash. I'm really worried about the direction of the US economy. I'm really worried about the quality of leadership in Washington. So I think your piece is incredibly pertinent, Iain, and I just don't really know who's in charge. I think we've had stimulus bill after COVID bill coming out of Congress. We've had massive tax cuts from Trump. And then there haven't been consequences so far. And I think there's a complacency in America. There aren't consequences until there are consequences. And I think they're just playing with almost a Russian roulette. One of these big stimulus bills is going to catch up with them eventually. And I think it might be this one if they do indeed pass it.
Yeah, further to that.
We haven't heard much from his vice president, have we? Who I always assumed would be the one who was running the country.
No.
She's no good. She did really badly in the Democratic primaries. She was supposed to be the great hope, and actually, was getting 2, 3, 4% in primaries. And then Joe Biden, committed to having a ethnic minority female. And frankly, there aren't many of them. And I think Kamala Harris just isn't up to the grade, unfortunately. I'm sure some will see me as racist for saying that, but I just
no. He's also I can't attribute this, but because it is a clever observation. But whoever first identified that he had given her the most difficult job in the administration.
Justin Webb.
It was Justin Webb, and it was a very very clever observation that essentially, if you want your vice president to succeed, you do what Obama did. If you want them to have an afterlife and maybe be your successor, then you give them something which is unattainable but really practical and isn't going to destroy them. So he gave Biden the battle to end cancer, in which huge strides have been made. But no one's going to then turn around and say you failed in your 8 years to cure cancer. He made him the head of the national task force and effort. So that was a friendly thing to do. Biden's White House gave Kamala Harris the southern border, which is beyond all this economic stuff, is the most difficult thing in American politics. And what do you know? It's unraveling on her watch. I find it's a bit too early to get into it at this stage. American political cycles are fast. The midterms will be here before we know it. But you've got to wonder about that ticket. I mean, is he going to run again? I mean, people tell me, who know about these things, tell me, yes, of course he will run again. No matter what condition he's in. But is she definitely the running mate? So the number of options from the Democrats, because of his age and because of her political vulnerability, you could see a completely different ticket emerge with an argument, which will depend a lot. As you said, Tim, that the American economy is the thing to really worry about. I was copied into a note from, I won't attribute it simply because there was a private note, but from one of our leading economists, who essentially said precisely that, was relatively relaxed about the British situation and more relaxed than I thought he would be about the euro and the ECB. But for the reasons that you described, just this crazy splurge continuing, if it happens, just pour it, pouring fuel on the fire. So who's next in terms of a story to pick? I think, Tim, it's you're next. Now, having got the first one wrong as the Wall Street Journal, I'm going to say that this is the National Post.
You're right.
Canada.
And so, well, you may have got the name wrong, but I wonder whether I've got the policy wrong. I'm slightly dreading Maggie's reaction to this recommendation. I think I'm about to be roasted, but it's interesting. What this is about is a move in various Canadian cities. National Post is the sort of leading, I think it still leans centre-right. It was founded by Conrad Black years ago to try and bring a sort of conservative voice into Canada's media landscape. I think it's sort of it's broader in its outlet now. But this piece sort of says there should be a vacancy tax of 1% on vacant properties, just to try and encourage those people from abroad, speculators from abroad or at home, to actually rent these properties out if they're not going to use them, and just generally damp down the amount of money that is going into speculation. And what interested me about this was that, whether it's New Zealand or Canada or Germany, the young are being priced out of the property market all over the Western world. I think part of it is related to the QE experiment we've had, just the amount of money that's gone into assets. And as the article makes the point that Vancouver have tried this policy, and they say that there's been a 25% drop in the amount of vacant properties. Now, I don't know whether other policies have been going on at the same time. I'm not sure whether there's a cause and effect relationship, but it just seemed to me to be an interesting idea to just encourage, the end of what we know, particularly in places like London, where you have street after street of largely unlit properties and underused. The article says, 1% probably isn't enough. When you've got property prices in most of Canada, which is what the article's about, rising by 7-8%, 1% barely dents the amount of profit. And and I'm a low tax conservative. I'm not in favor of taxing generally for no good reason, but I'd rather be taxing this, for example, than taxing the incomes of young workers. And so it seems to me a better form of tax than some of those that we're using. But I found it interesting, just pointing to the global nature of a problem we're very familiar with in Britain, and as one idea that we should look at and see how it works. If as Canada, Toronto and Vancouver and other Canadian cities experiment with this approach.
I think there's going to be a fashion, isn't there, for policies like this, because it is a global problem, or perceived to be a global problem. I think, I would rather you get back to, and this takes us back to interest rates, I would rather you get back to normal. I think part of the solution in terms of this bubble or boom that Britain's having, though it's not alone in having a property boom combined with a pandemic, which just seems weird. Any of us would have asked ahead of the pandemic, shut down the economy and shut down society for 18 months, what impact will it have on house prices? I don't think many of us would have predicted the substantial rises there'd be. But a lot of that, I think, is driven, economists will know better than me, but it's surely driven by credit conditions and just lots and lots of cheap money swirling around, and the government just trying to keep the show on the road, accentuated by the tax change on stamp duty, sort of stamp duty holiday that the UK Chancellor Rishi Sunak introduced. So I would rather see the credit conditions normalizing and getting back to. I sound like I'm obsessed by having higher rates for the sake of it.
You do.
But I just sort of see them as an essential component of capitalism and markets, and what banks and institutions do in terms of taking in deposits and then lending it out for people to be creative within the economy. And I think if you just artificially just sort of flatten that for so long, you end up just doing weird things to people's assumptions about how money works and about how the economy works. There's another dynamic which must be influencing the Treasury, because, well, I know the Treasury's view has long been, fine, you can do all that on foreign ownership, and there may be some public pressure for it, but there's a connection, maybe anecdotally, or maybe someone's done the work on it, between people buying property and then steering their investments towards London. So at a time when Britain is, as various central bankers put it, is reliant on the kindness of strangers, and with inflation, this unknown, you need people, you want people coming here, is the theory, not necessarily endorsing it, but the theory, you want people coming here, that if that means buying property, putting down some roots and feeling some connection, spending time here, and then.
Do we have any independent evaluation of that theory?
I don't know. No, someone having mentioned it to me, I should actually try and establish does it make any difference if you feel new developments full of people from from Singapore or from China or India, does that then mean that they make investment decisions differently? Don't know. Rather than going to buy a piece of property in Berlin or in Toronto. Maggie?
I think I would have a whole range of policies, because I think the housing market is stacked against the young, it's distorted, and although you said we've had a property boom, we haven't actually had a property boom, we've had pockets of booming as people through their behaviour have seen through the pandemic that they can live elsewhere. They've sold their very high priced London houses, moved down to places like Chichester and Norfolk Coast. I mean, let's start with the truth is everybody wants to live in the capital and the southeast, because that's where most of the work is. That demand will never stop. So you have to increase supply. And so I think we should be much more relaxed, even than they're doing at the moment, brownfield sites, much better building. But going back to second homes, I think I'd be even more, even though I supposedly would be more of a free marketeer, I suspect I'd actually limit it to 2 houses per person. I mean, I know a lot of people who've made good money in the city and they have a portfolio of 7, 8 houses on buy-to-let, letting it out. It feels so wrong. I can't.
Commie. Right. Maggie is a commie.
Yeah, no, not quite a commie. But Tim, going to your point and what they've done in Vancouver, and I believe in New Zealand, they tried to stop second homes entirely. I'm not going that far, but 1% tax is not going to stop them. I mean, one hears about flats in China, in Cambridge up the road, where the Chinese are just buying them off plan. I don't think 1% is going to stop that. I mean, do you want them buying that in Cambridge? It is a decision, but I think it's a big decision, and we have to take all the issues together. And I'd also bring stamp duty right down. I mean, if you talk about penalizing the young, people actually talk about it's 20 grand on top of, it's a tax. Why are they taxing you to buy your own home? It's insidious. That should go. Certainly reduce. So I think it's a huge problem, but we should tackle it. Yeah.
So should we? I think I had one more story, which I just wanted to flag as we come towards the end of the first edition of Press Review on Reaction, which we're hoping or we're planning will also be a podcast as well, and it'll grow and develop. Please tell us if you like the name, or you want it to be called something else, or what you'd like to see us explore. Then the details, how to contact me, Iain Martin, editor of Reaction, joined by Tim Montgomerie and Maggie Pagano from Reaction. Get in touch with us and let us know, both esteemed colleagues. Let us know what you think. And also, if you're not a subscriber to Reaction on YouTube, it's really straightforward. You just hit the subscribe button below. And you can also become a subscriber to Reaction and get all of the brilliant analysis, writing on politics, economics, and culture from the team. Again, below this in the bio is the details of the site Reaction, and there's a 30-day free free trial. So have a look at that. Yeah, the one last story I wanted to flag. Now, a fellow Times columnist, James Marriott, who's a brilliant youngster, which that sounds really patronizing, but he is young, and he's brilliant. And his column today highlighted something which I hadn't been aware of, the work of David Pearce, who's a leading advocate of the transhumanist movement, which is this Silicon Valley thing, which I was dimly aware of. This idea that you can, through machines and the computer age, the age we're moving into of AI, automation, and humans sort of losing control, that we'll transcend to sort of to a higher plane of existence. Whereas sort of the aim is to abolish pain or misfortune or difficulty, as James puts it. The world's last unpleasant experience, Pearce reckons, will be precisely datable event. And it's such an interesting piece. I mean, he's essentially, James says, this is hokum, and the part of what being human is about is pain, suffering. Most great art is about that is how, through those experiences, that's how we learn, and that's how we then learn to help others as well, to try and mitigate or prevent pain. But the idea of eliminating it completely and making mankind as a perfectible machine. I mean, it doesn't sound like a particularly pleasant or interesting or amusing existence. Also, I'm not sure it's possible. So I just wanted to highlight that. And it's also, it chimed with something else which I read recently, or we'd published recently, on Engelsberg Ideas, which is a site which the Reaction team also produce, which has a lot of the world's top academics writing on it. And you should, if you're not subscribed to that, email. And it was a piece about essentially rediscovering Christian humanism. Now, I'm in the kind of agnostic category. I'm in the Tom Holland category when it comes to these things, in that I'm culturally Christian and really interested in the way in which the roots of so much of how we behave and how we order our societies and how we behave towards each other are in that tradition. And the piece just very subtly reminds you that if we are moving into this crazy age of machines, with people like Mr. Pearce saying that machines will perfect us and make life perfectible, actually you do need, whether it's Christianity or whether it's humanism, you need that. And that ethical component, more than ever, roots back to Tim's story, your story earlier on about science and experimentation, Tim, in China, is if you don't have the ethical component, you do have rule by machines, which kind of eliminates the whole point of human existence. So I thought I'd just finish with a little jokey item there on,
That's really jokey.
On transhumanism and Christian humanism. But James Marriott expresses it rather brilliantly. Do we want to wrap up there?
Yeah, and will we put the links so that people who want to follow up, we'll put these on the main Reaction website so people can explore them. Yeah, exactly. So when we post this onto the site, each piece that we've mentioned, there'll be a link to that, so you can find the pieces. But if I can just be creepy, and one piece we should put up, creeping around you now after being rude about you earlier, I thought your piece in the Times today, Thursday, just talking about how the climate for Scottish independence was perhaps tilting a little bit against Nicola Sturgeon at the moment. I found it really interesting from someone who only sort of dips into this debate ever so often. Just that there may be a little bit of a shift taking place. I know you weren't counting your chickens, etc., but maybe we should link to that in there as well, because
thank you.
I always enjoy reading your columns, of course, but I thought that one was really interesting. Particularly. Very
kind. Yeah, I spent last week in Scotland, and unionists are not remotely complacent, but you can just sense that the atmosphere feels different, and people feel that they've got time and space to breathe, because the nationalists need this to feel inevitable, as though they love this, the sort of the clattering train. There's nothing unionists can do to stop it. This is just history happening. Devolution becomes independence, and the nationalists falling short in the recent election in Scotland in May, the devolved elections, and it just fell short by 1 or 2 seats, but they didn't get an overall majority. Difficult to do, to get an overall majority in the voting system, but still, they needed that for just the moral heft and authority to say, look, the party that stands for Scotland and for Scottish independence won a majority of the seats. Give us our independence referendum as soon as the COVID crisis comes to an end. So they would have envisaged next year. Falling short, and politics just very often, as we all know, sometimes just comes down to very small margins, as the Brexit referendum did, actually. But that's even though it's a small margin, it just changes the atmosphere. And there will be a fuss. She will ask for a referendum, and she'll say, look, she has the support of the Greens in the Scottish Parliament, which no one really takes seriously. And she'll say there must be a referendum. And Boris will, at the direction of, with the help of Michael Gove, who's running the government's policy in Scotland, will say no. And there'll be a lot more sort of shouting from Ian Blackford and various other people. But then what? And the nationalists know that they don't want to hold a Catalan-style, disastrous, illegal referendum. So there'll be shouting until it sort of dies down and people stop paying attention. And the reality is there isn't going to be a referendum this side of a UK general election. If the Tories win that next general election, they probably won't allow it either. It's not really in Labour's interests to be seen consorting with the nationalists either. So the route to getting a referendum, it's not impossible. I'm not saying it definitely can't happen. There could be some huge shock, some economic shock or a crisis or something which changes things. But the nationalists have Sturgeon towards the end of her career trajectory, which is a big moment for them. And as I said, no referendum in sight, and a domestic record, which is pretty pathetic. But so for that reason, I think there's a new quietly spoken unionist confidence that there's a bit of space, and that maybe Britain isn't finished after all, which as a unionist I find a rather cheering thought. But thank you, Tim, for highlighting the column, my column in the Times. We'll attach that to the links when we post this on the site. But you've been watching the first episode of Press Review from Reaction with me, Iain Martin, Tim Montgomerie, and Maggie Pagano. Thank you for watching.
I've got a name change. The Editors. Can't we steal it from the National Review? It's quite fun, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like that. Yeah.
The British Editors, or the Editors, the British edition. Yeah.
Sounds very 1970s.
So Press Review to be reviewed, maybe the Editors. But anyway, look out for the next episode next week, which will be me, Tim, and not Maggie, who's taking a few days off to luxuriate at home. And but we'll have more stories to discuss next week. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And we will get some graphics and theme music.